And we'll just let folks come on in for one more moment. And I think just about everybody's here. So I'm going to introduce Norma. Norma, would you start your video, please?
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to New Plaza's series of classic film talkbacks. I'm Norma Levy, president of New Plaza. We're a nonprofit showing independent and foreign films, and we provide film talkbacks and lectures as well. Today's film is a first-rate 1946 John Ford Western classic called My Darling Clementine. Today, Gary will be joined, as usual in this talkback, by his good friend Max Alvarez, the noted film historian. Hope you enjoy the event, and it's my great pleasure now to turn this over to Gary.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our regulars and some new viewers joining us today. Now, the estimable film critic Dave Kerr, who's now a film curator at the Museum of Modern Art, which will hopefully be back in business in a few months, once claimed that the two directors in movie history with the best compositional eyes were John Ford and Jean-Luc Godard. Now, you probably couldn't find two more diverse figures in movie history with their personalities, their politics, or subject matter across two 50-year-plus careers. But in rewatching the opening scene of My Darling Clementine this week, shot in Monument Valley in, I guess, northern Arizona / Colorado, now a national park, unfortunately now closed during the pandemic, I learned this week. But in that opening scene, Max, I immediately felt like I was once again comfortably in the hands of a master.
I couldn't agree more. And Gary, you took something of a risk today by inviting me to be part of this conversation, because I've always struggled with a lot of John Ford pictures. I see these extraordinary compositions that you're alluding to. And then oftentimes there's this a bit of a buzzkill for me when perhaps sentiment or very broad comedy tends to take away from the beauty of how some of the films are designed. And I'm always thinking of, you'll see Monument Valley, but then you may see Victor McLaglen and Barry Fitzgerald having a drunken brawl to some Irish theme in the background. And here, this film is just simply sublime. It's really Ford at the top of his powers at this time in his career. And it's just, I mean, I have a shot list here of scenes that you could frame and put up in a gallery, from the Monument Valley scenes, which are Ford's first visit to Monument Valley since Stagecoach, to so many others that I know we'll be talking more about.
Well, maybe I'm a little more tolerant being half Irish. And as Orson Welles said, he worshiped Ford for, you know, his visual acuity, and he ran Stagecoach multiple times while preparing Citizen Kane. And as he noted, you know, visual majesty, even if sometimes the screenplay seems written by Mother McCree. That was his description.
That sums it up very well.
You have a trailer which is going to show some of that beautiful stuff. The quality isn't as good as the feature, hopefully, that most of us saw, but it'll give us an idea. And it's a reissue trailer, we might note, also from a re-release of the picture a few years after 1946.
What they call an encore trailer. And once again, Gary, I think you and I could have come up with something a little more inspiring.
That's
but
right.
in any event,
we have to get a cutting room going on the side here, I think, for this program.
I think so. Let's take a look at the reissue trailer for My Darling Clementine.
Shave, please.
Well, we sure want to thank you, Mr.
Earp. Wyatt Earp.
What? You're not by any chance the marshal from Dodge City?
Ex-Marshal.
The first kiss is always the sweetest. From under a broad sombrero.
Told you to get out of town and stay out.
We're through talking, Marshal. My advice to you is start carrying your gun.
That's good advice.
Here's mighty entertainment that combines the exciting action of reckless pioneer days, the romantic conflicts of men and women who led perilous lives, the lusty humor of those who dared America's frontiers, and the breathtaking beauty of scenes filmed in the magnificence of the great Southwest.
Not to mention giving away some of the climactic moments of the picture as well.
And doing a very good job making it look like a typical Republic Pictures B programmer. There's none of the sense of the lyricism and the cinematic beauty of the film from what we saw.
Well, as we see from the credits, the guiding hand behind this film in many ways was a name that's come up a couple times on our broadcasts here, Darryl Zanuck, who we saw participating in Babyface, and then almost 2 decades later, I still think very daring No Way Out, the Joe Mankiewicz racial tension film. And you illuminated to me a little bit this week that directors like Ford, who were very busy again after World War II, when they had been away for most of the war, we'll talk about a little bit later, was off shooting another film, and Zanuck apparently shot a few scenes from My Darling Clementine and cut them into the picture after Ford had left, which was, again, not unusual during those days, but you sort of tracked those down in our research this week.
Yeah, it's so inconceivable for a lot of directors today to realize, and critics to realize, that at the time a movie like My Darling Clementine was made, the studios were functioning as factories churning out these films, and a director was often brought in after the script was developed and left before the editing stage. Ford was much more involved in the development of the script here, but he was not around for the final editing. He did complete a version of the film, and then after he left, as you indicated, Zanuck made some changes. There was another version prepared with these additional scenes, and they're jarring additions. I mean, we've just seen these extraordinary, genuine Monument Valley locations that you talked about, Gary. And then there's a scene where Wyatt Earp goes to the gravesite of his brother, and it's tacky town with the phony backdrop and the rubber cacti. And you're saying, what's going on here? Ford did not direct that scene. He also did not direct a scene after Clementine arrives in Tombstone, and she and Doc Holliday are outside the saloon talking and arguing. Both those scenes and a couple of others were directed by Lloyd Bacon, who did some serviceable work at Warner's.
Warner Brothers journeyman director.
Right. So, but Ford was not around for that, and there were some other subsequent changes to some trims that were made to the film and shifting around of music by Zanuck.
Right. It's so strange to think of today, where our leading auteur directors, like we know that Martin Scorsese was involved in every single cut of The Irishman, every we don't say foot of film anymore, but with in close collaboration with his longtime editor Thelma Schoonmaker, or we know that Michael Cimino, every single frame of Heaven's Gate was carefully put together by him. But and Ford is certainly on the auteur level, at least from our perspective today, but in a very different way in terms of how some of these pictures at least were assembled.
Well, absolutely, but you have to consider the output of the man. And I tried doing a statistical breakdown based on Joseph McBride's superb Ford.
Excellent biography.
And my numbers are actually a little different from his. I count, let's see if I get this, 104 completed feature films starting from around 1917, 4 movie serials, 23 two-reelers, 4 one-reelers, 1 3-reeler, there are government propaganda documentaries. There are directing portions of other people's films. There are even TV episodes this man directed. So he
Right.
could not have been around from start to finish on all those.
And a couple of them are very good. I don't know if you've seen them, and a couple of them are abysmal. But
Yes, it's
he had his hand in that as well.
so with my darling Clementine, this is the last really significant collaboration with Zanuck, who was an important collaborator. They worked together on The Grapes of Wrath, and they worked together on How Green Was My Valley.
Young Mr. Lincoln,
Young Mr. Lincoln.
Drums Along the Mohawk, a series of terrific pictures in the late 30s. It really made Ford's reputation after, a good on the average output of work in the 20s and 30s, but his career really took off from like the mid 30s on after The Informer, which I think was made at RKO, but a lot at Fox. But then for some reason he did very little at Fox after My Darling Clementine.
Yes, and it's too bad because Zanuck was a good collaborator with him. He kept Ford in check on a lot of things, and I had alluded to the fact that I have a short tolerance for some of Ford's excessive humor that he puts into a lot of his westerns and war pictures. Whereas here, the humor is beautifully contained, and some of the wittiest elements were Ford's additions, which we can talk more about. But I think the Zanuck influence also helps. And yes, he did come back to Fox in future years to start a picture like Pinky, to finish one like What Price Glory, but those are not in
Terrible.
League with his
One of his worst films. Well, for those of us for those of our viewers today who maybe haven't seen many or any Ford westerns up to this point, this is in some ways a good place to start. There's almost kind of a Zen-like, no frills simplicity about the film and the arc of the storyline. And one of the things that's always fascinated me, we talked about this week, that Ford was one of several big Hollywood directors who participated in World War II big time, was overseas for much of the war, shooting documentaries in dangerous and sometimes very far-flung places, was on Omaha Beach apparently on D-Day in 1944, shot some footage of the landing, which for some reason has very little of it's been seen publicly since then, but very influential, I think, on Steven Spielberg and others. So he was clearly, I think, affected as all these guys were by what they saw in World War II. And there's a bit of a sort of fatalistic nature to My Darling Clementine. A couple of major characters are shot in the back, and there's kind of almost like a film noir, a visual palette to the film.
Absolutely. In fact, we could say this is the very early traces of the psychological Western. And for those who maybe have underrated Westerns, the Westerns of the late 40s, 1950s are worth checking out because there's so much political symbolism in them, a lot of it tied in with the Cold War, post-World War II. And definitely, you're seeing the slow emergence of the anti-hero in this film. And there's a film noir element, absolutely. The scene early on in Tombstone where Wyatt Earp shoots the drunken Indian in the saloon, it's very much lit like a crime picture with the light pouring out into the street from behind. And there are some other extraordinary dark compositions in as well.
And in the first couple of reels, I think, almost as much rain as you see in a Kurosawa film or something.
And certainly Kurosawa was a great admirer of Ford's work. He influenced a lot of so many directors, and it's really all the elements fall beautifully into place here. And the one thing that I think we tend not to even notice, even in this day and age, that Ford was not big on moving his camera. There's not a lot of moving camera work here. I mean, when Clementine and Wyatt are walking into the church, where you hear, "Shall we gather by the river?" the camera is tracking with them a little bit. But Ford was not big on moving the camera. He liked the stationary camera, and his technique influenced other directors like Anthony Mann, who also preferred some stationary shots when he directed.
Right, he's a director I know, one that you've spent a lot of time studying and appreciating. Hopefully we get one of his westerns in here in a later episode, because they're really special as well. Jimmy Stewart was kind of his John Wayne or his Henry Fonda in absorbing the darkness, I think, of a lot of those narratives influenced by the time.
Absolutely, and in this film, I can just think there are so many stunning moments. You mentioned Monument Valley, but we have the what I call the porch shots, the shots. Well, the very famous one where Fonda is reclining in his chair and
Yes.
he's doing like almost bicycle motions with his legs against the post. That was inspired on the spot by Ford as they were filming. We talked about them walking to the church, which is very beautiful. There's just when the surgery, when the Chihuahua character of Linda Darnell has their surgery on her, there's that beautiful long shot or master shot in the saloon. It's very dark as everybody is watching the unseen surgery being performed. Low angle shot of Victor Mature after the surgery where his face is in shadow. It's just one beautiful composition after another.
Right. Well, we know that Henry Fonda and Ford, of course, had established a beautiful rapport in the late 30s with young Mr. Lincoln, with Grapes of Wrath. Some of us who've seen the Grapes of Wrath probably remember that famous soliloquy that Ford delivers, when he's talking to his mother, he's about to leave near the end of the film, and he says, well, don't worry, Ma, when a man is down on the ground, I'll be there. When somebody's being beaten up by a cop, I'll be there. And I remember driving several years ago on the 4th of July to a beach vacation, and on a national public radio station, they were playing the audio of that scene of Henry Fonda, the I'll be there speech, which I'm sure many of us know, on the 4th of July, which seemed oddly fitting, and John Ford might have appreciated it.
No, it was a powerful collaboration, and they are going to, after My Darling Clementine, they will get together the following year on The Fugitive, a film that Ford's biographer Joseph McBride hated, but I thought it was kind of an interesting.
Very loosely based on Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. Graham Greene and Ford perhaps had some spiritual kinship, but you wouldn't have known it from that film, I don't think.
No, but it's going to come to an end when they work on Mr. Roberts together in the 50s, and that's when Ford is inebriated during production, and he actually physically slugs Fonda, and then he's replaced by Mervyn LeRoy. But here they're at the top of their game, and he commands a very strong performance from Victor Mature. The women's roles perhaps less so.
That was Zanuck's contribution to the pictures, the female casting, right?
As far as we know, yes. Ford was not pleased with Linda Darnell in the film, but he was really not much of a woman's director. We don't think of strong women performances in Ford pictures outside of Maureen O'Hara, who could handle herself when she was with him. Kathy Downs was not the first choice for Clementine. Ford wanted Ann Baxter, who would have been, I think, terrific. But once, as you alluded, that was Zanuck's preference, was for Kathy Downs, who was a former model. And she had made a film for Robert Siodmak called The Dark Mirror. But then...
Yeah. That's a strange film.
Yeah, not much happened after My Darling Clementine.
Well, you mentioned, I don't know if we articulated this earlier, but one of the scenes not directed by Ford was the very final shot on the picture, which I've always thought was not bad, kind of a wistful goodbye between the two of them, but somehow a little awkward, and that Ford was not involved in that either, apparently.
It does have that reshoot feel, in the sense that you see Wyatt and Clementine, and they're kind of medium shots, and they appear to be in front of some cyclorama backdrop. And Ford had, I believe, wanted the climax to end with a handshake between the two of them, but Zanuck wanted more, and that's where the kiss appeared. And whether I don't know if that was by the other director that I had mentioned or someone else, but that's also was an additive.
Well, on the plus side, I've always loved the beautifully dark performance of Walter Brennan in the film. I don't know if he did too much of that in his career, but and this sort of almost psychotic hold that he has over his sons at one point is, when you pull your gun, kill a man.
Yeah, great line, and it's a chilling performance from Brennan, who, as you mentioned, the shocking moment where he shoots the man in the back. That is right out of the darkest elements of film noir.
And we're told that he shot the youngest brother in the back too, at late in the film.
Yes, and I think that's what the scene that stood out for me, and I was not aware that Brennan hated Ford. I thought they were compatriots, but in fact, he really hated him so much he never worked with him again after My Darling Clementine.
Well, I guess Ford did inspire some strong emotions, pro and con. I think another thing we talked about this week in his enormous filmography, I think one of the tragedies of movie history, unfortunately, dozens of his silent films have been lost. We might have a more nuanced picture of his career if we had been able to see a couple dozen films that he made, many of them at 20th Century Fox in the 20s and late teens, which some of which tackled interesting material. I think only maybe 12 or 15 of his silent films still exist, which is very sad.
There were about, if we include those shorter length ones, he directed about 44 silent films. And unfortunately, so many of them were made at Universal Pictures, which has one of the worst records for silent film preservation because they destroyed their negatives, and I believe it was the late 40s. But it would have given us so much more of an insight into his work, because I imagine his magnificent composition skills date to his work as a silent director, which in the silence that survive, we get a little taste of that. But where you have to capture the nuance of a scene and the emotions of a scene without any dialogue or narration, and certainly that would have given us some insight into what led to this. There are different John Fords. There's the B-movie cowboy director of the silent years, and then there's
but exquisitely composed in many cases.
Beautifully composed. And then there's the more socially conscious films that were emerging in the 30s, thanks to the writer Dudley Nichols. And then this post-war period, which is going to get darker in many ways in films such as this one.
I think that we would think of him as enlightened and progressive in the issues of many of his films, but there are also these bizarre bits of history and personal, like that he started out as a stuntman, a horseman, I guess, on a number of 1 and 2 reel westerns, and he was also, according to Joe McBride's excellent bio, he was one of the Ku Klux Klansmen riding around in The Birth of a Nation, and he has a still to prove it in his bio. And Ford himself was apparently really obsessed with the Civil War. He made a couple of Civil War pictures during his career, and with racial issues, he employed actors like Woody Strode in many of his films, but. Then we have in one of his most famous and now I guess notorious films, The Searchers, a character played by John Wayne, who is a very unpleasant, sort of flagrant racist in the course of pursuing the Natalie Wood character through the arc of that film.
And Peter Bogdanovich had stated that Ford had intended Wayne's character to be racist because that was consistent with the period. But there's a great deal of political schizophrenia in Ford's work, and the 30s it seems like the late 30s seems a little bit more progressive politics setting in, perhaps thanks to Dudley Nichols, his liberal screenwriter. Ford had mentioned in correspondence before World War II that he considered himself very politically left. But then he's doing all this work for the Office of War Information during World War II. These just blatant propaganda pictures that are glorifying, Doolittle's 1,000-plane raid and things of that nature, and the racial politics all over the place. He directs a film in the early 30s. Version of Aerosmith, based on Sinclair Lewis, which has a very modern view of a black physician. But then you have Stephen.
That's what I'd like to see again.
Later, and other issues later on. So it's very erratic, which is typical of a lot of Hollywood directors.
Yeah, I think if we were, so those of our viewers today maybe who aren't familiar with Ford's career or would like to revisit these films, I think there's most of his important sound films are still available, fortunately, and some of his better silence as well. They're out there, and I think some of the ones we've just rattled off are good places to start. There's another lesser-known film called Pilgrimage, set in World War I, which I think is one of his best films. And then, of course, Young Mr. Lincoln, Grapes of Wrath, How Green Was My Valley, My Darling Clementine, Fort Apache, The Quiet Man, The Searchers. That'll keep everyone busy for a while.
He wore a yellow ribbon, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and there's just a tremendous amount of, it's amazing that the body of work. Interestingly enough, Wyatt Earp, there's a whole mythology to the OK Corral.
You know the kind of the movie history of Wyatt Earp, at least prior to My Darling Clementine, I know from talking this week.
So Wyatt Earp was not very well known until a 1931 biography came out, which pretty much made up all kinds of stuff. And And then Fox made a 1934 film based on that biography with George O'Brien. And then in 1939, they remade it, this time with Randolph Scott. And My Darling Clementine is technically a remake of at least the second film that Alan Dwan was the director for. Ford was inspired by certain elements, but obviously made quite a number of changes. But
Well,
in terms of history, it's not an accurate portrayal of what happened at the OK Corral.
And then I was thinking, after we discussed that in the mid-90s, you may recall, it was one very ambitious Wyatt Earp film starring Kevin Costner, 3.5 hours, commercially unsuccessful, and then sort of a B picture.
I reviewed that. I totally forgot about that.
A B picture called Tombstone.
It was called. Lawrence Kasdan directed it. I thought it would never end, but it was beautiful looking.
And then a B picture, I think probably in script and execution, called Tombstone, came out around the same time, which was a hit, unlike Wyatt Earp. Kurt Russell, I believe, stars in it.
Well, the Western format, at least in the 40s and the 50s, and this is why I think we can't do this putting up the nose at it, because it gave directors a chance and writers a chance to address a lot of issues they might not have been able to address in a modern setting. They could deal with, capitalism, the railroad company wanting to steal people's lands to build a railroad, or the land baron stealing the lands of farmers, things like that. They could, they could deal with they could touch on racial issues, even if it was discrimination against the Indians or the Mexicans. So
I've always felt that a great director can say it all in a Western, and many of them have, even some whose forte wasn't the Western.
And Ford, he's changing his views a lot during his career as a Western director. Here, Wyatt Earp is portrayed in the very romanticized, mythologized way. But when James Stewart played Wyatt Earp in Cheyenne Autumn in 1964, he was almost a comic buffoon in this comic relief segment that didn't quite work. But Ford had clearly changed his views, perhaps, on the Wyatt Earp character. And also the treatment of the American Indians is more sympathetic in that film than, say, The Searchers.
Right. Well, hopefully we've got some people with questions, both who are coming to John Ford for the first time, and others who've revisited My Darling Clementine. So as I think most of you know, don't forget to push those two buttons, the button at the bottom of your screen.
Okay, I'll help you out, Gary.
Yes.
This one's the participant button, and then the raise hand button.
Thank you, Saul.
My pleasure.
The man behind the curtain.
Actually, I'm gonna ask a question, if everybody will indulge me. I think this is my first question.
Absolutely.
So near the end of the movie, where Wyatt Earp is going to get Doc Holliday, bring him back, that shootout, that sort of went away very quickly. His hand shot, he shoots him in the hand. I thought that was very accurate. And then he comes in and performs surgery, as if he didn't have a bullet in his hand. Help me out with that.
I was waiting for someone to say a flesh wound. This is just a flesh wound, but you're right. It is something they kind of discard and not go any further with. I know Gary might have some thoughts to add.
Well, I think there's a couple of examples of that. And then when Henry Fonda shoots one of the Clanton boys, in that scene I quoted, when you pull your gun, kill a man, he seems to have been shot and goes down, but he's up again. By the end of that scene, to be beaten by his father with a whip and crying out like a 4-year-old boy or something as he's being beaten. So credibility and continuity not at the top of the list.
Yeah, that happens, especially in these stop and start productions where everybody is putting in their 2 cents on how a scene should be shot and reshot and a scene should be written. The main writer on the film, I want to make sure I get this correctly. Winston Miller was the main writer, although you'll notice in the credits he is second banana to the producer, who's given top credit. The producer just muscled his way in.
That's a very odd producer taking a writing credit. You don't see that too often.
Apparently, according to one account, I forget which of the 2 Ford biographies I read mentioned this, but The producer did it because he said, everybody knows there's only one real producer in a John Ford movie. So he figured if he got his name as a co-writer, he'd get more respect. But Winston Miller had a lot to do with it. Although Ford, as I mentioned, he did cut dialogue during filming, and he did insert a couple of humorous bits. Like my favorite is the exchange where Wyatt Earp says to the bartender, Mac, have you ever been in love? And the bartender responds, no, Marshall, I've been a bartender all my life. That was Ford's. That was the case with the Fordian humor, I think, worked beautifully.
And Henry Fonda's body language with his feet almost reminded me of, Toshiro Mifune as a samurai or something, leaning against a tree, some kind of...
Ford, he loved the way that Fonda moved, and that's why he wanted to film that scene where Wyatt Earp and Clementine are walking along the porch on the way to the church dance, and he had Fonda repeat the dance that he did in Young Mr. Lincoln when he and Clementine are dancing to the same piece of music, "Oh, Dem Golden Slippers." That was the same music that Fonda as Lincoln danced to in Young Mr. Lincoln 7 years earlier.
Another one of his most beautiful films, I think.
And I believe the Criterion edition of My Darling Clementine features both versions of the film, the version we've all seen, and I believe the pre-release Ford edit as well.
Have to go back
They
and
discovered at UCLA.
Thanks, guys. So we've got a couple of hands raised. I want to remind everybody this session is being recorded. And I'm going to ask Lee, please start your video.
Hi, guys.
Another continuity question.
Listen, it's cocktail hour in my house, so I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
First of all, Ward Bond, did this start his career as a cowboy?
Oh,
I only know him as cowboy.
we see, Barry may remember some other Westerns. We've seen Ward Bond in roles throughout the 1930s as motorcycle cops and just walk-on parts.
And I know him on television as a cowboy.
And in terms of Westerns, I can't say for certain whether he had done Westerns prior to My Darling Clementine.
Okay.
But he had a long association with Ford.
Yeah, he's not in Stagecoach. And I think Ford didn't really make any other Westerns in the 30s, but I think he had cast Bond. Like he's in Young Mr. Lincoln, for example, Ward Bond. He's one of the ne'er-do-wells of the town, I think, who gets involved in the trial of the courtroom climax of the movie. And,
Okay.
and he turns up in some pre-coders, I think, as well, getting humiliated or one thing or another.
Why not?
This is probably one of the first major Westerns. Just go ahead, sorry.
Why not remake this in color?
Well, as a matter of fact, Ford had wanted this to be a Technicolor film originally. When he envisioned doing the remake for Zanuck, he envisioned it as a Technicolor film. And it wasn't clear in the books written about Ford whose decision it was to go to black and white. But it's inconceivable to think of this as a color film because of the way it was composed. But certainly it would have worked as a color film in another way. There were other directors like John Sturges who did Gunfight at the OK Corral, and later on in the
Fox was making Technicolor films at that time, including in a very different vein. Another film I'd like to see us do is Leave Her to Heaven, Fox 1945.
We must do Leave Her to Heaven at one point, Gary.
So in light of what you said about Kathy Downs, and in light of the Me Too movement, we all know that Darryl Zanuck had a casting couch. Could it be that that's why he insisted that she get the role?
Lee, are you suggesting there were sexual compromises in Hollywood at this time? I don't know what you mean.
Between the 1900s and now, yes.
For the last 100 years, Zanuck was notorious for the casting couch, and it's very, very believable that he would have chosen an actress that there had been some relationship with. Absolutely, that was how things worked at Fox.
Like I said, it's cocktail hour in my house. Lots of things could come out of my mouth now.
The story is told.
Okay, we have more questions. Bye, Lee.
Thank you, Lee.
Save us a glass.
Thank you so much, Lee. Um, Barry, would you please start your video? You good to go, Barry?
Hello. Oh, we can't hear you.
Oh, we just shut him off.
Is that Barry Schulman?
Yes, sir. Hi, Gary.
We were chatting briefly this week at one of Barry's previous hats that he wore.
Thank you. Yes, I did wear several hats. This movie was brilliant, and I had never seen it, and I thank you for suggesting it. One thing stood out noticeably for me. Yes, it's a 1946 film, and yes, Alfred Newman is credited with scoring the movie. But the end of the movie leading up to the gunfight is noticeably lacking all music. It is austere.
A beautiful stroke.
And it is just strikingly different than any director would make today. Was that typical of all of Ford's work? Or was there something else that I've missed in this, but it was so glaringly, obviously silent, other than the natural sound that came from the action?
I am good.
What's the backstory here?
All right, so you've hit on something so important, and my theory is that was Zanuck's input, because Zanuck was not big on the bombastic scores. You heard occasionally in Fox films, yes, but it wasn't like Warner Brothers. And oh my God, if this had been a Warner Brothers film in 1946, there would have been,
Max Steiner would have beat you over the head with it or something, right?
Exactly. The minute they were climbing over the fence with the guns, everything would have been emphasized. No music, so powerful. But if you look at the other Ford Zanuck collaborations, Grapes of Wrath, not a lot of music in the background as the Joes are working their way across the country. So I believe that was Zanuck's impact, not to spoil that with music, if I had to make a guess.
Gary, you agree?
I agree, and I think that even I think we saw in speaking of Zanuck again in No Way Out, the picture was some very dramatic scenes that are not scored. I think Max was clocking it. The first hour of the film, there's virtually no music, right?
Yeah.
Leave Her to Heaven, the film that Gary just mentions. I'm not going to give anything away, but one of the most famous scenes in that.
Oh, yes, I know the one you're talking about.
Don't give it away. No music. Dead silent, and I think it was a Zanuck preference, which
it was very impactful. It was powerful because of that.
Very much so.
Thank you.
Thank you, and the compositions for that are beautiful. The way Ford places his camera, just extraordinary in those scenes.
Thank you, Barry. We're going to ask Daniel, please raise your to start your video. And I'm going to remind everybody that if you want to ask a question, please go ahead and hit the participant button and then raise your hand. So Daniel, are you good to go?
Yes. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
I want to begin by saying that I am shocked that you two guys who always highlight the work of the cinematographer have not so far mentioned Joseph McDonald's name.
You're right.
I was thinking about that, and actually, he did very little work for John Ford. That's an interesting thing to me.
Ford
had a lot of his one or two regular guys.
Now, there have been many alcohol-infused late-night discussions over who is responsible for the look of a film, and it's usually a collaboration between the director of photography and the director, with various influences being heavier at certain times. If you look at McDonald's filmography, prior to Clementine, he had done The Dark Corner and Shock, two memorable noirs, and after Clementine, he did Call Northside 777, Panic in the Streets for Kazan,
Terrifically shot film,
Niagara, and the classic Pickup on South Street for Sam Fuller. So he brought along with him a sense of noir lighting and composition and high contrast. And I want to cite one other film of his, which I happened to see for the first time about 2 or 3 days ago. And the first, say, 40 minutes of this Western are a primer on cattle driving and how it's not as easy as you might think. And that film I know is well known to Max because its title is Alvarez Kelly.
By Edward Dmytryk, right?
Yes. And it's a pretty good film. It's not a great classic, but there's some good writing and some terrific action scenes. I want to cite one other visual touch, which really touched me, was the shot where Doc Holliday gets killed. And he has with him his towel that he has been coughing into with his tuberculosis for most of the film. And after he goes down, the towel is left on the fence post, flapping in the breeze.
Yes, towel choreography.
Yeah. I don't know whose idea it was, but it was brilliant and very touching, I thought.
That the towel, it's subtle. It's like you're noticing it, but it's not. The way they do it is perfect. And I'm glad you mentioned McDonald, because he was a master of.
Yeah, you read our minds about that. We were thinking about this, and he had relatively little work with Ford, but.
And it is a challenge. Who is responsible? And sometimes it's collaboration. And in most of Ford's cases, his word was law with regard to composition. However, the following year, when he made the Henry Fonda film The Fugitive, and a lot of filming down in Mexico, the cinematographer was Gabriel Figueroa.
That's right.
Who apparently insisted on deciding where the camera was going to be placed, and Ford let him, which I can't imagine, but apparently that was the case. So that's interesting. So.
I do want to cite one other interesting example, and that a lot of the deep focus work, especially in the interiors and the saloon, etc., were very reminiscent of Citizen Kane, which was pretty much controlled by Greg Toland, who taught Wells how to direct a film, pretty much. So who knows how much Ford let McDonald control on this, but it's a brilliant job all around, and I thank you both.
Oh, thank you. And so many directors were inspired by Citizen Kane. And just in fairness to Orson Welles, we have discovered his unreleased silent film, Too Much Johnson from 1939, which has some pretty extraordinary cinematography. So
yes,
let's say Toland definitely continued his education.
And love to talk about it, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We have two more questioners. We're going to go to Joan, and right now, after Joan, we're going to go Diana. So, Joan, would you please turn on your video?
Yeah, I just did. I think I did.
Yep, you're all good.
Yeah. I had two questions. I don't know that much about Westerns. They've never been my favorite genre, except I recently have fallen in love with The Searchers. Just because it's been on TCM a lot, and I like it a lot. But this movie reminded me of, at that last scene, it reminded me of High Noon a little bit.
That's right.
And I don't know whether that's a crazy analogy or not.
Well, the use of the horses to divert the Clanton brothers, and as everyone's scrambling wildly around at the end.
Yeah, that whole bit, and also the walk to the Clanton brothers. The way they walk up the street. That's what I kept thinking about. And I wondered, how is this film typical of other 1946 films? Or is it?
Well, it's certainly, I would say, tapping into that post-war, darker psychological theme that's starting to emerge in crime pictures like that came out that year. And Gary, we can mention there are a lot of films in '46 that are taking us to a darker place.
You get the feeling that Henry Fonda's Wyatt Earp. He has seen bad things, and he expects to see more bad things. What kind of a town is this?
Do you both think he's going to return for Kathy, for Clementine, or not?
Zanuck thought so.
Zanuck thought so. I wasn't entirely certain, but Zanuck definitely thought so. And in terms of the Victor Mature Doc Holliday character, he's working his way towards anti-hero status. Maybe if the film had been made 10 years later at the time of The Searchers, he would have been even a darker character in terms of his behavior. He's a little bit, yes, he steals or whatever, or he shoots people, but he's more likable than maybe he would have been by the 50s.
I see. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much, the talk.
Thanks, John. Well, more Westerns for you.
All right. Thank you, Joan.
Okay.
Sorry. Diana, there you go.
Right. I don't have a background in westerns because I grew up in England, and
Well, they were Diana. They were popular in the UK, weren't they?
they weren't apparently popular with my family. Who knows?
Uh-huh.
So therefore, I'm going to ask a stupid question, probably.
There's no such thing as a stupid question.
Stupid question.
On this program.
Wyatt Earp, are you talking about a recurrent character or somebody who actually existed in that life?
Thank you for asking that question. There was an actual Wyatt Earp. This is supposed to be based on a true story, but so many liberties were taken with it. And a lot of it have to do with that 1931 biography we mentioned. So there was a shootout. It technically was not at the OK Corral. It was down a ways from the OK Corral. It only lasted 30 seconds. It went by so quickly the participants weren't even sure what happened. Doc Holliday did not die in the gunfight. He died later on. It was things like that. And Wyatt Earp was only a marshal for 8 of his 80 years. So there was a myth that was created about Wyatt Earp because very few people knew who he was until this book came out, and then he became a legend. So there was a real Wyatt Earp.
Right. I believe he passes through. If any of us are fans of the densely obscene HBO series Deadwood, I believe he passes through Deadwood at some point. He and one of his brothers.
I'm sure he does.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. So we've got 2 more questioners. Or maybe even 3. Thank you for raising your hands, folks. So we're going to go to Marianne and then to Jean. So hold on one second. Marianne, go ahead.
Hi, guys. I'm like Diane. I was not too much raised in Western. So I had 3 questions. The first one was the song, My Darling Clementine. Was it written for the movie, or is it a song that existed before?
It was, I don't know the exact a time when it was written, but it was, I guess you'd call it an old standby. It was a well-known melody that
probably from the 19th century, Max, right?
That would make sense to me, yes, from the 19th century.
Like a Stephen Foster song.
Gary, the actor Walter Brennan.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit more about him?
Well, he was a very popular actor, and I believe he holds the record for winning the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor 3 consecutive years, I believe. Max, 1936 through 38. Does that sound right?
He won a total of 4, I believe, in supporting actor. But you're right. I think there was a successive run there.
Usually playing kind of a nicer, more folksier character. This is a very dark performance by Walter Brennan, fascinatingly so, I think. Mm-hmm. And then he became a television star in the 50s and 60s in a very saccharine series called The Real McCoys. And I remember I had to sit and watch with my grandparents a few times during those days.
Was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. And when he was offered a role, apparently his first question was, do you want it with teeth or without? Because his teeth were artificial. So he could play the old timer without the teeth, or he could play more of a character actor with them. But he definitely was a style. He could play things for laughs, or in this case, something much more serious.
And so my last question was about the end. Do you think they're going to see each other again?
Well, we were just joking about that earlier, and the fact that the producer, head of the studio, inserted that scene, at least in the way it was staged, at the end of the picture, to give you some optimism. I think.
Okay.
John Ford's opinion is unrecorded on this, Max, as far as we know, right?
No, and also I can't tell you if it happened in real life because the character of Clementine was invented for the film. So.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. We're going to ask Jean to please start your video, and then after Jean, we'll go to Norma, and that will be our last question. Jean, let me unmute you, or unmute yourself, please. Excellent. You're good to go. Thank you.
Okay. I think I had read, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I had read that John Ford, in his very early years, he got to know Wyatt Earp. Maybe Earp had buddies in the film industry or something, and he's said to have gotten him a cup of coffee and chatted with him, that sort of thing. I had read that on Wikipedia.
He did. You're not exaggerating. He did know Wyatt Earp. And when he was interviewed by Peter Bogdanovich, he told Bogdanovich that he reproduced the OK Corral quote exactly the way it had been. But as I've mentioned, there were liberties taken. But he did know Wyatt Earp. You're right.
Okay. Going back to Linda Darnell, I'm sure it's so typical in a lot of these Hollywood movies where actors are cast because they have to pass as a Mexican or, mulatto or black person or whatever. And did she often get stuck in those kind of roles, or she had this thing going with Zanuck and she got in it?
Well, we've seen, Gary will have to be able to add to this, but there's a lot of range to the work she did at Fox. I mean, she's playing this woman of mixed race here, but then 2 years later, she's going to be doing sophisticated comedy for Preston Sturges in Unfaithfully Yours. And then in 1950, at the time, No Way Out in 1950.
In No Way Out. Otto Preminger's excellent Fallen Angel, I think. So she
yes, and she's like a working class waitress in Fallen Angel. So really, I'm a huge fan of hers because I think she shows a tremendous amount of range. So she wasn't typecast, really. Unusual for such an attractive woman. They always just want to typecast them in glamorous parts.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed, I think right before the big shootout, the sheriff, Henry Ford, Fonda, sorry, he goes down the list of what these bad guys are being charged with, the murder of this one, the shooting of that one, but he hasn't mentioned, didn't they shoot Linda Darnell as well?
That's right. We never saw where that bullet came from. That was fired by John Ireland, who had been having an assignation with Linda Darnell and then jumped out the window. But then when he heard information being revealed, he put her out of commission.
Okay, so it wasn't one of the Clantons.
Well, yeah, John Ireland is one of the Clanton sons.
Okay,
we never actually see who fired that shot, so that's.
Okay, but they weren't charged with that attempted murder.
They had enough. They had enough going on, and
legal sloppiness there.
Yeah. So, and there were other things written on the internet about how Wyatt Earp, of course, had this very colorful life. Going from boomtown to boomtown throughout the West and kind of following the money and, common law wives and legal wives. And that even after he died, his wife worked very hard to kind of clean up his image. That it was kind of a pretty sordid.
You shouldn't have brought this up because now I got another note here.
It's a rabbit hole.
So the Earp brothers apparently were known more as sporting men than lawmen. So I guess frequenters of brothels and things. And apparently they were actually known as the fighting pimps in some quarters. I read that in one of the Ford bios. So yes, he was a colorful character.
Yeah.
No, that's how they turned up in Deadwood, I believe.
Well, and one of his wife, she ran a brothel. And apparently Wyatt Earp was kind of the security for it, that kind of thing. And that sort of information they wanted to clean up,
that would have been an interesting additive to the film, but
yeah.
A few years to...
That's the American West. It's full of all kinds of mythology. So thank you. I enjoyed
Thank you
that.
very much.
Thank you, Jane. So, gentlemen, we're going to turn it over to our last questioner, which is going to be Norma. Norma, if you wouldn't mind starting your video. And Norma, there you go.
This is really a sort of a generic question. Are Westerns dead? I mean, is there a reason why in the 21st century Westerns really are dead, and why they're not being made anymore? Is everything said to be that could be said, or is just technology rendered that something of the past that it makes it no longer relevant?
Well, I think that's not quite true, Norma. There are some recent Westerns. There was the Coen brothers' Ballot of Buster Scruggs, sort of an omnibus film. I thought very well done by their standards. There's a big Western coming out whenever movie theaters get open again, starring Tom Hanks and directed by the British director whose name is escaping me at the moment, who did a couple of the Bourne Identity films and United 93.
You know, Michael.
Something News of the World, I think, is the name of this film.
So they're still making them occasionally.
No, they're still making them occasionally. Certainly, they're and TV series like Deadwood, although that's over a decade now when that was on. But they're not quite dead yet. And as I said before, I think, you know, good filmmakers can say it all in a Western, and hopefully they'll continue to get chances to do so.
Great. Thank you, Norma.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Hey, Max, do you want to tell us what's coming?
Oh, certainly, Saul. Thank you so much, and thank you, Gary. So on the next presentation I'm going to be doing for New Plaza Cinema is going to be Wednesday, October 14th. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's correct. Wednesday, October 14th. And it's going to be on movie stunts, the history of movie stunts. And Gary has selected as our talkback film that week, which is going to be 4 days later on Sunday, October 18th. I wish Sean was here. We're going to be doing Richard Rush's 1980 film, The Stuntman, which is a great dark comedy about movie production and Steve Railsback becoming a stuntman for a very autocratic film director played brilliantly by Peter O'Toole. And Barbara Hershey is also in that film. So Gary and I will be discussing that on Sunday, October 18th. And just to get you in the mood for my presentation, here is a very brief trailer on what you can expect partially on October 14th when I give my talk.